Richard III is remembered less as a king than as a monster, twisted, scheming, blood-stained, and accused of murdering his nephews. But the real question is not whether Richard was innocent, but why history needed him monstrous. After the Wars of the Roses, the Tudors needed an old villain to make themselves look like rescuers. So Richard's story became a warning. Evil seized the throne and justice dragged it down. But when we pull that legend apart, the story becomes messier, darker, and much more human. Richard was born in 1452, not into a peaceful kingdom, but into an England already torn open by family war. His family belonged to the House of York, and their enemies belonged to the House of Lancaster. Later generations called this struggle the Wars of the Roses. This was not a romantic feud of noble knights. It was a long civil war of alliances, inheritance claims, betrayals, exile, and executions. While Richard was still a child, he learned one brutal lesson. Blood could protect you, but it could also make you a target. His father, Richard, Duke of York, was killed in 1460. His older brother, Edmund, Earl of Rutland, also died in the conflict. Young Richard did not grow up inside a stable court. He grew up under the shadow of defeat, escape, and family revenge. His eldest brother Edward later seized the throne and became Edward IV. That victory turned the Yorks from rebels into rulers. For Richard, Edward was not just a brother. He was protector, king, and the center of Richard's early political world. Richard was raised for a time in the household of the Earl of Warwick, a normal noble education, but also a political one. Warwick was known as the kingmaker. In that household, Richard learned more than manners. He learned how power moved. He learned that alliances could turn, promises could break, and today's friend might arrive tomorrow with an army. That matters because Richard's later reputation often makes him seem born evil, as if murder was waiting inside him from the beginning. The real Richard was shaped inside a world that pushed young nobles quickly into violent politics. Edward IV's rule was not secure either. He was handsome, forceful, and militarily gifted, but his marriage created a serious problem. He secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, an English widow, instead of choosing a diplomatic marriage among Europe's ruling houses. The Woodville family quickly gained offices, marriages, and influence, which made many older nobles feel pushed aside. Richard's tension with the Woodvilles was not just personal dislike, it was a crack in the kingdom's distribution of power. When Warwick rebelled against Edward, Richard stayed with his brother. That part of the story is often forgotten. He did not abandon Edward during the first great storm. He followed him into exile and helped him recover the throne. In 1471, Edward returned to power. The Lancastrian Prince Edward died after Tewkesbury, and Henry VI soon died in the Tower. Richard was still young, but he was already deeply involved in the bloodiest settlements of his age. That does not mean his hands were clean. No major noble in the Wars of the Roses had truly clean hands. But turning Richard alone into a demon makes the whole violence of the era look like one man's sickness. Edward IV rewarded Richard with major power and responsibility in the north of England. Richard became Duke of Gloucester, building a northern political base and handling borders, defense, justice, and noble relationships. Here we meet a Richard hidden by the later legend. Not a stage monster, but a working regional lord. In the north, he seems to have gained real support. Later records suggest some local elites saw him as an effective protector. He was involved in legal and administrative affairs and showed interest in certain reforms that do not fit a purely savage image. Of course, none of this makes him a good man in the modern sense. He remained a hard noble in medieval power politics. He used pressure, rewarded allies, controlled enemies, and acted harshly when dynastic security seemed threatened. But that complexity is exactly why the label bloody tyrant feels too convenient and too clean. In 1483, Edward IV died suddenly. That moment changed everything. The heir was Edward V, a young boy. His uncle Richard was named Lord Protector. In theory, this should have been a temporary arrangement, protect the boy king until he could rule for himself. But every noble in England understood that a child king meant a vacuum, and power vacuums never stay empty. The young king was surrounded by the Woodville family. Richard was in the north, while control of the crown was moving toward London. For Richard, the question may have been whether he could truly govern as protector, or whether the Woodvilles would shut him out. For the Woodvilles, the question may have looked exactly reversed, whether they needed to control the king before Richard seized power. This is where Richard's story becomes dangerous. Each side could explain its own moves as self-defense. Richard intercepted the young king's party at Stony Stratford and arrested several Woodville relatives and supporters. Among them was Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers. He was later executed without the kind of open public trial that could clear the air. This is a real stain Richard cannot easily escape. Whatever his motives, this was a ruthless political purge. The young Edward V was brought to the Tower of London. At the time, the Tower was not only a prison, it was also a royal residence. But in the later imagination, that move sounds like the story already walking into the shadow of murder. Edward V's younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, was later brought into the Tower as well. These two boys became the famous princes in the Tower. At first, they were still seen, then gradually they vanished from public view. That disappearance became the darkest and most difficult mystery in Richard III's reputation. Before the coronation, Richard's political path suddenly changed. He was no longer only protector, he was moving toward the crown. A claim began to circulate that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid because Edward had supposedly been pre-contracted to another woman. If that claim was accepted, Edward IV's children could be treated as illegitimate, with no legal right to inherit. Parliament later confirmed this argument, and Richard was offered the crown as Richard III. The problem is that the process looked extremely convenient. It removed the boy king and placed the crown directly in Richard's hands. But medieval kingship was never only about blood. Legitimacy, support, church authority, and noble consent could all reshape succession. Richard's coronation did not mean everyone believed him innocent. It meant he had gathered enough power for the moment. Resistance began quickly. Some men who had once supported the Yorkist cause started turning against Richard. The Duke of Buckingham's rebellion failed, but it revealed one key fact: Richard's regime was unstable from the start. Whether the princes were already dead had no public answer, but their silence itself became a political weapon. If they were alive, they were a threat to Richard's throne. If they were dead, they were a curse on his name. That is the horror of the case. Whatever the truth was, Richard stood in the worst possible position. He had motive, he had custody, he benefited from their disappearance. Those facts make suspicion impossible to erase. But the evidence does not give us a complete confession, and it does not give us an undisputed killer. Later writers and historians have discussed other suspects, including the Duke of Buckingham and even people connected to Henry Tudor. Yet those alternative theories have problems too. Many depend on speculation, political possibility, and later narrative needs. The most responsible answer is that Richard remains the obvious suspect, but the case is not solved beyond all modern doubt. That is less dramatic than the monster uncle murdered his nephews, but it is closer to how history must handle evidence. Richard's reign was short, lasting only about 2 years. It was too brief for him to fully reshape his own image. He did support some legal measures, including attention to bail, property seizure concerns, and access to legal texts. These details do not make an exciting thumbnail, but they remind us Richard was not only a plotting stage villain. At the same time, he continued to hold power harshly. He executed enemies, seized lands, redistributed offices, and relied on loyal affinity networks. His problem was that once a crown rested on controversy, every act of mercy could look like weakness. After his wife, Anne Neville, died, Richard's private life became surrounded by rumor again. His only legitimate son had already died, making the question of succession dangerous once more. A controversial king without a secure heir is easy to portray as a man abandoned by heaven. Meanwhile, Henry Tudor was gathering support overseas. His blood claim was weak, but he carried a powerful promise. He could promise to end the civil wars. He could marry Elizabeth of York and join the rival lines together. In a tired country, the promise of ending chaos can sometimes matter more than the purest claim by blood. In 1485, Henry Tudor landed in England. Richard marched out to meet him, and fate tightened at Bosworth Field. Shakespeare would later give Richard a theatrical ending. The real battlefield was not a morality play, but a contest of alliances, terrain, and betrayal. The Stanley family's uncertain loyalty became decisive as their final choice helped determine the battle's outcome. Richard did not hide inside a palace. He personally charged, trying to strike directly at Henry Tudor. That does not fit the image of a cowardly schemer. It looks more like a medieval warrior king, making one final gamble. Richard died on the battlefield, becoming the last English king to be killed in battle. His body was carried away and displayed in humiliation. The victors had not only killed a king, they began taking control of his story. Henry Tudor became Henry VII. He needed Richard to look less like a rival claimant and more like a tyrant who had to be removed. The new dynasty's legitimacy was fragile, so the more evil the last king looked, the more justified the new king seemed. This is why Richard's image quickly moved from defeated ruler to moral cautionary tale. Tudor histories were not just recording facts. They were also explaining why the current rulers deserved to rule. Later, Thomas More wrote a highly influential portrait of Richard, though his account is not simple modern historical evidence. Then Shakespeare turned that image into immortal drama, a deformed body, a twisted soul, and a smile hiding murder. Shakespeare's Richard is a brilliant dramatic character, but a brilliant dramatic character is not the same as a reliable historical portrait. The problem is that drama is easier to remember than archives. The Richard on stage outlived the Richard in records. For centuries, people saw the sneering villain instead of the northern administrator, Yorkist nobleman, and disputed king. Even his body was shaped by legend. Hunchbacked deformity was used to suggest moral evil. In 2012, Richard's remains were discovered in Leicester. Research showed he did have scoliosis, but not the monstrous body of Shakespearean legend. That discovery was symbolic. The bones did not make him innocent, but they did overturn a body myth enlarged by drama. His remains reminded people that historical figures were once real human beings, not just labels needed by later generations. So how should we judge Richard III? Saying he was completely innocent would be dishonest. His path to the throne was filled with coercion, suspicious legality, and deadly political purges. The disappearance of the princes in the Tower still weighs on his name, and he clearly had the strongest opportunity and benefit. But saying he was only a naturally evil, bloodthirsty monster is also historical laziness. That version lets us avoid understanding the Wars of the Roses, Tudor propaganda, and the way power manufactures memory. Richard III may have committed a terrible crime, and he may also have been burdened with more evil than the evidence can carry. The truest answer may sit between those extremes, not a saint, not only a devil, but a man shaped by civil war and rewritten by the winners. That is why his story still matters. It is not about finding a perfect answer, but about how history turns complicated people into simple monsters.